If its levees break, a metropolis would be flooded.
There are two kinds of levees, those that have failed and those that will fail.
No, this isn't New Orleans. This disaster could happen in Sacramento, California. All it would take is one superstorm, and 250,000 people would be at the mercy of raging floodwaters.
Evacuating 100,000 people is a very tall order.
The region would be crippled, a state government out of business.
This could have a real devastating impact on the state and the national economy, and maybe even on the worldwide economy.
It's already happened in New Orleans. 80% of the city was flooded by multiple failures in the levee system.
These walls had the rug pulled out from under them.
160,000 homes were destroyed. More than 1,000 people were killed. Now, Sacramento could be the next Katrina. It's a frightening parallel to one of the biggest mega disasters in U.S. history. A megastorm strikes an American city. Levees fail, causing massive flooding. Thousands flee, but some don't make it out in time. It's a now familiar scenario, but in this case, it's happening in California.
Of the major metropolitan areas in this country, Sacramento is at the highest risk of catastrophic flooding.
Sacramento, California could be our next Katrina.
Part of the problem we have here is we have a couple thousand miles of old levees that were generally poorly built. And that's the legacy we have here.
Nearly 2 million people live in the Sacramento metropolitan area. It is the capital of California, the 7th largest economy in the world. Like New Orleans, Sacramento relies on a levee system to protect the city from flooding.
When we live in the shadow of levees and we look at these big, huge earthen embankments, we think that somehow it makes us safe. And what Katrina reminded us is that don't make it safe.
It would take just one large storm to begin a chain of events that would cause a mega disaster in California. This worst-case future scenario would begin with the Pineapple Express, a storm system that originates near the Hawaiian Islands and can last up to 10 days. Scientists estimate these massive rainstorms can hit the West Coast every 10 years.
It acts almost like a hose. It just squirts water, and wherever that hose is aimed is where you have the real potential to have major flooding.
Not only could the warm tropical storm dump 12 inches of rain on Sacramento, but it could also melt the snowpack in the mountains above the city.
So all that water, which is dumped very quickly, comes out of the mountains in a hurry. In less than 48 hours, it comes down. And of course, Sacramento is sitting right at the base of the mountain.
The two major rivers that flow through Sacramento could be overwhelmed by a monster storm surge. In turn, the levee systems on both rivers would fail, flooding the city.
Because the velocities are so high and the water depths are so high. When that occurs, that's when people get hurt.
As the storm surge roars through Sacramento, cars could be washed off the congested freeways. The Capitol building could be flooded, and the state government would shut down. More than 130,000 homes could be inundated by up to 15 feet of water in some neighborhoods. For the people caught in these floodwaters, some will be lucky enough to be rescued, but others may not be so fortunate. By the time it ends, hundreds of square miles of property could be devastated. Sacramento's levees are in dire need of repair. On February 24, 2006, Governor Schwarzenegger declared a state of emergency and increased the flood maintenance budget by 70%. It's a race against time. If efforts to upgrade the flood control system fail, the results will be devastating. We don't have to look very far back in time to understand the destruction a levee break can cause.
We underappreciate the power of water. It is an unstoppable force, particularly once it breaks through a levee.
Hurricane Katrina was an event that altered the face of America. It also caused the most destructive flood in United States history. In the months following the disaster, experts from both Northern California and Louisiana debated what had led to the catastrophic failure of the levees. Some officials claimed that the levees had been overtopped. But now, a team of scientists from Louisiana State University is searching for new evidence as to why the levees failed.
The flooding of New Orleans is a man-made disaster, and the trigger was Katrina. If the man-made levees hadn't have failed, Katrina would have been a case of mopping up some water and that's it.
New Orleans wouldn't exist without its levee system. The city was established in 1718 on the only high ground adjacent to the Mississippi River. This area became the French Quarter.
In the case of New Orleans, we actually have a city that's in a bowl that's below sea level. That is because New Orleans was built on a swamp. And as they drained the swamp to allow the houses to be developed, the swamp soils contracted, they subsided, and over the years, the whole city has subsided below sea level.
The city didn't really grow until the early 1900s, when an engineer named Baldwin Wood it was only built to withstand the storm surges from a Category 3 hurricane. In August of 2005, as Katrina, a Category 5 hurricane, bore down on New Orleans, fears began to mount that the levee system wouldn't be able to protect the city.
We had closed all of our floodgates, we had inspected our levees. And so with a storm of this magnitude, all we could do at that point in time was to wait and see what was going to happen.
State flood manager Mike Stack was ordered to evacuate to Baton Rouge, about 60 miles north of New Orleans.
Everybody's first duty, so to speak, is to stay out of harm's way so you can react to the situation. It's a feeling of helplessness. Do a lot of praying.
At 6:10 a.m. Monday, August 29th, Katrina made landfall 60 miles southeast of New Orleans. She had weakened to a Category 3 with winds between 111 and 130 miles per hour.
I thought the levees would be able to withstand the storm. I felt they were well engineered.
During the height of the storm, all emergency workers had to take cover, so they had no way of knowing what damage to the levee system Katrina was causing.
I myself went to the St. Bernard Parish Government Complex, the Emergency Operations Center.
Hurricanes spin counterclockwise, so the eastern part of the city was subjected to the most devastating elements of the storm. Katrina's 110-mile-an-hour winds created a 20-foot tsunami-like wave. This massive storm surge charged into New Orleans from the...
Try to set up that shelter.
At emergency operations centers across the city, officials struggled to get a handle on what was going on.
Sometime after 9 o'clock, we began to get calls from areas east of Parish Road, which we all knew that we were in for a catastrophic event because the water was coming over every single levee that we had.
Then the building that Bob Turner was in began to flood.
The water came in and created a whirlpool effect in the lobby of the government complex and just took all of the file cabinets, all the computers, all the desks that were in the various offices, swirled them around in the lobby.
With communication systems barely working, officials were unable to get a complete picture of the damage until 24 hours after the storm had passed. The first shock was the 17th Street Canal that empties into Lake Pontchartrain. There, on the eastern side of the canal, was a 151-yard breach in the levee. Water was rushing into the nearby neighborhood. Every single house was inundated by 10 feet of water.
We first became aware of the levee breaches on Tuesday, the day after landfall, around noon. At that time, authorities were saying that the 17th Street Canal had failed due to overtopping, that this was an act of God. We had such a big storm, such big surge, that we'd overtopped the levees, The overtopping had eroded the back of the system, and it had failed.
Officials also discovered 2 more levee failures on the London Avenue Canal. Water was streaming into the city, and nobody could stop it. 80% of the city was flooding, and it would take 2 weeks for emergency crews to plug the levees, and then another month to pump out the water. But while emergency repairs were progressing, a storm of controversy was brewing. There was no clear explanation for the failure of both the 17th Street and London Avenue levees, which had inundated downtown New Orleans.
I knew that there was potential for some of the walls to be overtopped, but I never thought we'd have failures in the walls.
Because they were on the western side of the eye, these levees were only subjected to 70-mile-per-hour winds coupled with an 11-foot storm surge, which engineers believed they could easily handle.
Unfortunately, the authorities kept putting this spin out that it was overtopping and, you know, it's an act of God and it's not our fault. And we started to feel, hang on, it is somebody's fault because these things shouldn't have failed.
Experts fear that we could be facing another Katrina. This time on the West Coast. Like New Orleans, Sacramento, California is protected by levees. So if a Pineapple Express storm strikes the area, the torrential rain could overwhelm the levees, unleashing millions of gallons of water into the city. Hurricane Katrina underscored the fragility of the levee systems that protect many cities.
Levees are the ultimate in engineering hubris. These piles of dirt are going to hold back these floods, which are capable of sculpting the earth. We can't hold the water back. All levees do is they manage it.
In Katrina's aftermath, 169 miles of the 350 miles of levees around New Orleans were either damaged or destroyed. While the levees were being repaired, the Louisiana State University Hurricane Center started its investigation. The question, was this an act of God or engineering failure?
This became a forensic study. In fact, if you will, we were looking at each of the breaches as a crime scene because we wanted to know every little thing that we could. Was it a failure because of design? Was it a failure because it was badly constructed?
A team of scientists and engineers combed through the destruction looking for clues. Paul Kemp was one of the investigators.
Now, what we did was we came in with the same assumptions that everyone else had. That was that the storm was so big that the water went over top of all the levees and caused failures because the levees were not built to withstand that kind of storm. And then when we came down, we saw the evidence on the ground and in the high water marks that told us no. What happened here was we had a big storm, but it was not a storm that should have caused this much damage.
The biggest clue as to what happened at the 17th Street Canal was the resting place of the flood wall itself.
Well, not every levee breach leaves its own tombstones, and these monoliths that you see here say a lot about how this particular failure occurred.
The flood wall fell backwards toward the canal, which pointed investigators to a flaw in its construction. The 17th Street Canal was built using an I floodwall design. A sheet of steel was driven 17 feet into the levee. Then a concrete wall was attached to the steel sheet. This gives the levee an additional 8 feet of flood protection. Once the water got underneath the earthen levee, it lubricated the layers of soil, so they separated. Then the pressure of the surge moved the entire structure.
What failed was the foundation that they were positioned in. And so basically these walls had the rug pulled out from under them. And so when that happened, then they fell back towards the canal.
The LSU team was astounded by the incredible power of the storm surge. The
force of the water pushed the levee, pushed the wall as one piece, and it actually caused the ground where we're standing here to start to wrinkle up and to push up, and they call that a heave. And some of these houses were heaved up and moved laterally, and they ended up on top of trees.
At the London Avenue Canal, the levees failed for an entirely different reason. When investigators arrived on the scene, they were presented with a mystery of sorts.
Once we got here, we were pretty shocked to find beach sand everywhere. And I'm a coastal scientist, and I felt right at home. This was essentially the kind of sand that we would find in on the beaches at Santa Rosa Island in Florida. Mounds and mounds of it everywhere. Where did it come from?
The sand came from the foundation of the levee. It provided an important clue as to why the London Avenue levee failed.
When the levee failed here, it didn't fall over like it did at the 17th Street. Here, the hole appeared underneath the levee and the levee fell into the hole.
Engineers characterized this as a blowout. The levee was built on a foundation of sand, which was quickly washed away by the rushing water, creating a 35-foot hole into which the levee wall fell. The LSU team concluded that all the levee failures on both London Avenue and 17th Street were caused by design errors by the Army Corps of Engineers. The Corps had not taken the weak soil conditions into account when they built the levees. They also learned that the Corps was using antiquated flood projections from 1959 for its designs.
As a consequence, they designed for a very weak storm. Combine that with not taking into account the soils, cost cutting on the designs of the levees, and we ended up with a system that failed catastrophically.
The LSU team concluded that 87% of all the water that flooded New Orleans came from levee failures, not overtopping. And these failures unleashed a powerful force.
When you look at a natural disaster in terms of what is the most destructive, it's invariably water. Water is very heavy compared to air, and as it moves, it has a lot of momentum, has a lot of energy, so it can knock down buildings, move motor vehicles, scour out huge holes. In fact, it's far more devastating than wind or even fire.
More than 160,000 homes were destroyed by Katrina, a testament to the devastating destruction that happens when a house is inundated by water. One year after Katrina, most of these neighborhoods sit vacant. Many fear that most residents will never return. And even if they do, the city will never be the same. Could this be the fate that lies in store for Sacramento? The area is subject to mega floods and is a low-lying city that depends on a vulnerable levee system.
One really hopes that Californians look to Louisiana and realize what could happen to them before it's too late, before they have their Katrina.
The first levees were built 4,000 years ago in China on the Yellow River. Since then, they have been breached more than 1,500 times. The worst flood happened in 1931, killing over 850,000 people. Water is one of the most destructive elements on Earth. And Katrina was testament to its power. Today, there are endless miles of ruins in New Orleans. Some fear the city will never recover from the devastation. Yet there is another Katrina that could happen in Sacramento. Hurricanes don't hit California. But there's another kind of storm that can be just as devastating.
The Pineapple Express is the weather system that can create some of the worst flooding in California.
The Pineapple Express is a superstorm, a series of rainstorms that only happens during the winter. It's a weather system that stretches thousands of miles out into the Pacific Ocean, lasting 7 to 10 days.
Once flooding starts, the last thing you want is more rain. But in a Pineapple Express, that's exactly what you're going to get, because you have this very long fetch of moisture that is still aimed at California, and so you're still going to get more waves coming through.
To make matters worse, the storm picks up warm moisture from the Hawaiian Islands, which it dumps on the Sierra Nevada mountain range only 75 miles east of Sacramento. The warm rain can melt the snowpack, sending up to 16 million tons of water into Sacramento.
It's a double whammy. You get a warm, intense storm and catastrophic melting of the snow.
This is a serious threat to the capital city of California. The downtown area is next to the confluence of two major rivers, the Sacramento and the American. Both of these rivers are fed by the Sierra Nevada snowpack.
If you have a flood on the Sacramento system that arrives at Sacramento at the same time as the flood that comes down the American River, you've got a problem. You've got a serious problem.
To control the water coming down the American River, the state of California built Folsom Dam. The 9-mile-long earthen dam with a concrete spillway holds about 10,000 surface acres of water and protects 1 million people who live downstream. When the dam was completed in 1955, state water experts predicted it would take a year of storms to fill the reservoir. 7 months later, a storm came through and filled it within 2 weeks. The dam was designed so that during a monster storm, its large capacity could hold back floodwaters and protect the Sacramento levee system. But today, experts have discovered some flaws in its design.
The dam, when it was designed, really wasn't designed as a flood control structure. That is, you can't do emergency releases from this dam until it's practically full. If you know a storm is coming, you can't rapidly empty this dam because they never designed it that way.
Experts are also worried that the dam isn't big enough to control the megastorms that could roll in off the Pacific Ocean. Jeffrey Mount and his colleagues at the University of California at Davis are attempting to come up with a more realistic flood model.
I think that erosion is going to take place. Sacramento's history of flood management is a classic case of using the past to predict the future and getting it wrong. When they built Folsom Dam in the 1950s, their understanding of the hydrology of that system was relatively short. I really hadn't been paying attention but for about 50 years. And in that 50 years, it had been kind of what I'd call a kinder, gentler climate with not big floods, not big droughts. We have a series of floods of modest size before 1950, and everybody assumed the hydrology would be the same. But right afterwards, starting in 1955, in the 70s there were several floods. Of course, there was a big flood in 1986 and then a whopper in 1997. So the climate in the second half of the 20th century has almost nothing to do with the climate in the first half. Regrettably, we designed our flood control system based entirely on the first half of the 20th century.
Adding to this threat, global warming may be increasing ocean temperatures, causing bigger and more powerful storms in the future.
Climate in California is getting more variable with bigger storms, more frequent storms. What do we do about that in our flood planning? We don't have a method yet to deal with it.
Based on this new flood data, scientists now fear the reservoir behind Folsom Dam isn't big enough to handle such a high volume of water. Today, the state of California is making plans to raise the dam by 7 feet, thus increasing its capacity.
If Folsom Dam is overwhelmed, it won't be overtopped. There is a spillway to the side of the dam, which has a potential capacity of 250,000 cubic feet per second, more than twice what the downstream levees can really accommodate. And so the dam won't be impaired, but the city will be.
Flood control officials would have to open all of Folsom Dam's floodgates and let the water out. Sacramento would then be at the mercy of a massive storm surge rumbling down the American River. If improvements are not made, the primary defense for the city would be a levee system that many believe is inadequate.
At that point, I would be trying to get my piano up to the second floor and out of the water.
Will the levees hold? Can Sacramento avert a mega disaster? Experts believe that the levee system that protects Sacramento could suffer a catastrophic failure, similar to the disaster that struck New Orleans in 2005. Amazingly, the design and construction of levees in and around the Sacramento area hasn't changed much since their original construction 150 years ago.
We've improved the technology of levees, but it's still an antique design.
The portion of the London Avenue levee in New Orleans that failed also was built on top of sand, which was washed away by floodwaters and led to its collapse.
This sandy material here that's eroding away is actually eroding the base of the levee. The water is literally washing away the foundation of the levee. And if this continues to happen, the levee will collapse.
One advantage Sacramento has over New Orleans is that during a Pineapple Express storm, they can deploy teams of flood fighters to help shore up the levees. Sacramento doesn't get the deadly high-velocity winds that occur during a hurricane, so emergency crews can be on the job 24/7, fighting to keep the levees intact.
The job of these flood fighters is to identify a problem with the levee and then to attack that problem.
The city also has helicopters equipped with infrared cameras that can inspect each and every levee from the air. Any underground leakage invisible to the naked eye will show up on a heat-seeking camera.
We're not going to take the attitude, well, the levee's going to fail, so we'll just let it fail. We're going to attack that problem.
City and government officials realize they are facing a serious threat. They asked a group of engineers headed by David Ford to simulate an urban flood disaster for Sacramento. Their findings were frightening.
I think it would have an impact on Sacramento that's similar to the impact that we're seeing in New Orleans. And so Sacramento after this event would be quite unlike Sacramento is today.
Ford's team constructed its scenario by factoring in 3 key ingredients: geology, the landscape and elevation of Sacramento; demographics, where the dense pockets of population are within the city; hydrology, how the city would flood if the weakest levees broke.
When we considered this event, we all stopped and kind of took a deep breath because we realized that this could have a real devastating impact on the state and the national economy and maybe even on the worldwide economy.
Ford's scenario shows that more than 300,000 people and 140,000 structures are in the direct path of this potential mega disaster. As was the case in New Orleans, some people will only have minutes to outrun a 10-foot wall of water. Next, using David Ford's computer model and cutting-edge special effects, we will take you inside a mega flood. California's own Katrina. Before Katrina, the worst American levee disaster happened in 1927 on the Mississippi River. 246 people were killed, and another 700,000 were displaced. It's almost unimaginable. The devastation of Katrina all but destroyed New Orleans. Now another American city stands in the crosshairs of a similar mega disaster. It hasn't happened yet, but if the system is not improved in time, the levees in Sacramento could fail, causing a catastrophic flood. Now, using the latest scientific data and computer simulations, we can give you a first-hand look at the destruction that would be unleashed if rainstorms overwhelmed Sacramento's fragile levee system. It would start with the Pineapple Express, a superstorm that blows in from the Pacific Ocean. 10 days of unrelenting warm tropical rain begin to melt the Sierra snowpack in the mountain range east of the city. Millions of gallons of water head down the Sacramento and the American rivers, bound for the capital city of California. As the surge reaches Folsom Dam, all the floodgates are open so the dam doesn't overtop. Now out of control, the floodwaters rage down the American River, raking a massive amount of debris off the banks of the river.
That alone then is going to increase the risk of downstream levee failures and generally creating a very bad situation.
The surge takes out bridges and anything else that gets in its way.
The scenario that we considered, we wouldn't want to be standing on this bridge. Folsom Dam, which is some distance upstream, would be releasing about 160,000 cubic feet per second. And that kind of flow rate in this channel would fill the channel completely from levee to levee.
Realizing the oncoming danger, state officials put out the word to evacuate the parts of the city near the levees. As the surge on the American River nears downtown Sacramento, it reaches a narrow channel between two levees, which amplifies the raging waters.
As it gets narrower and narrower, the velocities in the river are going to increase. As it comes to this corner, it would be very much like a NASCAR car going around a corner at the racetrack, except instead of making the turn, it would hit the levee and erode out the levee and create the breach that we analyzed.
Ford's scenario shows that the flood surge could drive straight into the levee instead of making the turn. The earthen embankment would be quickly washed away.
You get such a high velocity through the breach. Well, the water is so powerful. As it widens the levee, it will erode huge chunks of the levee and it will fall into the water with a boom.
With the levee down, a 10-foot wall of water could flood the city. It travels 3 miles through downtown.
So the water's going to spread very quickly through this, moving on downstream, and creating a lot of havoc and causing a lot of damage.
It could flood the state capitol building, causing the state government to shut down and evacuate to a safer location. Next, Ford's simulation predicts a flood surge on the Sacramento River that breaks through an unstable levee 15 miles north of the Capitol. Quickly, the floodwaters spread through Natomas, one of the fastest-growing areas of Sacramento. According to Ford's computer model, this breach could be the most dangerous because it would impact the most people.
Here's the location of the levee breach that we considered, and we're at approximately location B. We're standing in this parking lot in the Natomas neighborhood of Sacramento. The flow would come down through the area and flood to a depth of about 20 feet deep here in the southern end. These structures that are behind me would have water completely covering the first floor and in many cases up into the second floor.
Ford estimates that the flooding in this area could go on for at least a week. A swath of 100 square miles could be covered, subjecting 250,000 people to floodwaters up to 20 feet deep. The Natomas floodwaters could also shut down the Sacramento airport. About 10 miles south of Natomas on the Sacramento River, a third levee break could happen in an area known as the Pocket. The Department of Water Resources has identified this location as a place where the levee has been seriously eroded and prone to failure. At least 100,000 people are at risk.
The houses adjoining the levee would be severely impacted. Many of them would be obliterated. Another block or so away, the homes probably would stay intact, but they'd be essentially flooded and inundated up into their second story.
Like New Orleans, the wave of water from the breach could knock most of these houses near the levee off their foundations. Now, with 3 levee failures all happening simultaneously, emergency rescue crews are forced to make some difficult choices of who to rescue first.
I think probably a third levee failure in Sacramento would overtax first responders and emergency managers.
This is a case where it would take months and months to reconstruct because of the very large area of flooded property here. It's not one house or 10 houses. We're talking hundreds and thousands of houses here.
And like New Orleans, the price tag could be astronomical. if its levees break, a metropolis would be flooded.
There are two kinds of levees, those that have failed and those that will fail.
No, this isn't New Orleans. This disaster could happen in Sacramento, California. All it would take is one superstorm, and 250,000 people would be at the mercy of raging floodwaters.
Evacuating 100,000 people is a very tall order.
The region would be crippled. A state government alga storm strikes an American city. Levees fail, causing massive flooding. Thousands flee, but some don't make it out in time. It's a now familiar scenario, but in this case, it's happening in California.
Of the major metropolitan areas in this country, Sacramento is at the highest risk of catastrophic flooding.
Sacramento, California could be our next Katrina.
Part of the problem we have here is we have a couple thousand miles of old levees that were generally poorly built. And that's the legacy we have here.
Nearly 2 million people live in the Sacramento metropolitan area. It is the capital of California, the 7th largest economy in the world. Like New Orleans, Sacramento relies on a levee system to protect the city from flooding.
When we live in the shadow of levees and we look at these big, huge earthen embankments, we think that somehow it makes us safe. What Katrina reminded us is that don't make it safe.
It would take just one large storm to begin a chain of events that would cause a mega disaster in California. This worst-case future scenario would begin with the Pineapple Express, a storm system that originates near the Hawaiian Islands and can last up to 10 days. Scientists estimate these massive rainstorms can hit the West Coast every 10 years.
It acts almost like a hose. It just squirts water, and wherever that hose is aimed is where you have the real potential to have major flooding.
Not only could the warm tropical storm dump 12 inches of rain on Sacramento, but it could also melt the snowpack in the mountains above the city.
So all that water, which is dumped very quickly, comes out of the mountains in a hurry. In less than 48 hours, it comes down. And of course, Sacramento is sitting right at the base of the mountain.
The two major rivers that flow through Sacramento could be overwhelmed by a monster storm surge. In turn, the levee systems on both rivers would fail, flooding the city.
Because the velocities are so high and the water depths are so high. When that occurs, that's when people get hurt.
As the storm surge roars through Sacramento, cars could be washed off the congested freeways. The Capitol building could be flooded, and the state government would shut down. More than 130,000 homes could be inundated by up to 15 feet of water in some neighborhoods. Out of business.
This could have a real devastating impact on the state and the national economy, and maybe even on the worldwide economy.
It's already happened in New Orleans. 80% of the city was flooded by multiple failures in the levee system.
These walls had the rug pulled out from under them.
160,000 homes were destroyed. More than 1,000 people were killed. Now, Sacramento could be the next Katrina. It's a frightening parallel to one of the biggest mega disasters in U.S. history.